This video is brought to you by Squarespace. From websites and online stores to marketing tools and even analytics, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence and run your business. Welcome back, everyone. In this video, we are going to be taking a look at the brand new Nikon Z6 II. I was a big fan of the first version of the Z6. I think the image quality on it was outstanding. I think it was one of the better video packages, especially at this price point. And I've had a lot of fun shooting on the Z6 over the last couple years, just in terms of the way it mounts legacy Nikon glass. I think it's a really well-rounded camera with great image quality. So I was really excited to finally get a chance to try the Z6 II, which we're going to look at in this video. Now, when you check this camera out initially, not a lot has changed. In fact, the bodies are very similar. There's maybe some minor changes, mainly the fact that we have dual card slots now, but it is the same sensor, the same LCD screen, the same viewfinder. There's a lot of it that's the same. So what has changed on this camera? Well, the biggest addition here is we now have an additional processor. So the original version just had one XPEED 6 processor. This version actually has dual XPEED 6 processors. So you can imagine that we're going to be able to increase the performance, the responsiveness of the camera, and just have a better package in general. Now, in terms of image quality, Nikon are boasting a better dynamic range performance, and this actually is noticeable, particularly if you're trying to rescue shadow detail or maybe bring back some highlights that started to blow. I did notice a little bit of a difference, and that says a lot because I thought the original Z6 had excellent image quality. You're going to get just a little bit better out of this camera. And of course, we also have better performance in terms of high-speed shooting. If you do a lot of high-speed shooting, you're going to notice there is a much larger buffer on this camera. Nikon are saying that it is 3.5 times the size of the previous version. You can shoot a lot. And so if you're shooting RAW, you can get well over 100 images. I was finding consistently with burst speed, the buffer clears pretty quickly, a couple seconds, and you're ready to go again. So it's a pretty good performer in terms of high-speed shooting. One of the biggest complaints on the original Z6 was that it only featured one card slot. Well, we now have dual card slots. On the original version, Nikon went with the XQD. This is a really good choice in terms of speed and performance in a card, but the cards are also expensive. So I thought it was interesting this time around we have dual slots. The other one is an SD slot, and it is UHS-2. So you are going to get very high speeds. I do want to note, though, that if you have the camera set up to mirror each card, so the other one is a backup, you are going to notice a slight drop in performance just because there's more having to be written to cards. But other than that, I think it's a really good setup, and I think Nikon made a smart choice here. Nikon are also saying that blackout has improved on this camera considerably. I will be honest, I don't do a whole lot of high-speed shooting for the stuff that I do, and there is blackout. Now, if you want to get rid of that entirely, there really is only one camera on the market right now, which would be the Sony A9 or its successor, the A9 II. But those are the only cameras that actually offer true blackout performance. It's because they've got a dual CMOS stack configuration on their sensor. You're not going to find that in these cameras. So considering it is what it is, I don't really notice that there's that much improvement. But then again, I'm not a sports shooter, so I'm not on that all the time. But if you are, probably would be nice to know that you have a little less blackout. But if I were a sports shooter, I'd kind of prefer no blackout. So we're not quite there yet. In terms of autofocus, though, there are some major improvements in this camera. And this is where you're going to see the dual processors really showing themselves. Because first of all, the autofocus tracking is pretty fast. You're going to get about 12 frames a second, they're saying, and it's very accurate. And so one thing I really love now is the way that Nikon has addressed the switching back and forth between human and animal IAF in the user interface. You can get to this by using the default front function button and then just twisting the front dial to switch between them. This is something that on Sony cameras is very frustrating because you have to go deep into the menus, or you can set up a custom button to switch back and forth between them. I really like the way, though, that Nikon has set this up. Another new thing on here is they have a restricted area autofocus as well. So in the past on the Z6, when we got IAF, if you had more than one person in the scene, you would actually see the little arrow appear and you could use the dial to switch around to tell it which eye you wanted to focus on. Now we can limit that area and we can just put it over one person's face, and then that is the predominant area. So this might be useful if you shoot a lot of group shots, a lot of people, and you want to restrict that area. I think that is something that's very awesome. Now you can't change the size of that area, and hopefully that might be something we see in a firmware update, but I love that it's there. Eye detect is also much improved. You might remember in the original Z6 how sometimes it would actually focus on an eyelash and not the person's eye. Well, that's been sorted out and you get consistent eye performance all the time. Autofocus tracking is an area that I was hoping to see an improvement on. Now, in terms of performance, it's very good. As I mentioned, you're going to get about 12 frames a second, but just setting it up is something that I think is a little bit of a problem that I wish Nikon would address in their menu system and their firmware. So to do it right now, you have to make sure you're in autofocus autofocus continuous and you select all point areas. Then you press the OK button on the back of the camera and you're going to get your tracking select, or you could touch the screen and select something directly. Once you're tracking, it is locked on and it does perform just fine, but then you have to press a button to deactivate it. And anyway, that pressing of buttons is just one more step and you have to move your hand position to do it. And I wish Nikon had a way like Sony just to track immediately, which actually brings me to another small criticism. Now, this is super nitpicky, and I do understand that Nikon have come from making DSLRs that had a live mode to going to something that is a full-time live mode mirrorless camera. I think they've done an exceptional job on that, but there are still some holes in the UI. I mentioned these in my original Z6 video, and they can be pretty frustrating. So two things I want to draw your attention to. One is the joystick on the back of the camera. The other is the functionality to half press the shutter button. Now let's talk about what those do in most cameras. So usually you can half press the shutter button to acquire focus, but you can also use it to exit whatever info screen or menu setting you're in to go back into the live view. This is one thing that is very inconsistent still on the Z6. So for instance, if I'm in the menus, I can't just come back out, and more frustrating for me because I shoot a lot of manual focus. I will zoom in for critical focus. Now to zoom in, you have two dedicated buttons on the back, but once I've zoomed in, I can't just half press the shutter to whip it back into live view. You can take an image and it will go back to live view, but to get it back, you have to actually use the minus magnifier on here to come back out to full screen. And it just seems that that's an extra step. Once again, actually it's several button presses depending on how zoomed you are in for critical focus, but that's something that could be a lot faster if they would address it. Now, in terms of the joystick, on most cameras, this pretty much will mirror what happens on the dial pad below. So for instance, you can use this to move your autofocus point around, which is excellent if you're using the viewfinder. You can also use it to navigate the menu system, and I guess this is just a preference of mine. I tend to live on the joystick, and if I'm in the menus, for the most part, you can navigate that menu system with the joystick. It also has a great touch interface, but a lot of times I just find myself, because of the way I approach cameras, to use the joystick. The thing that drives me nuts is the way that these come out of the box. Is when you press the middle of the joystick, you might think you're selecting an item, and what it does is it actually acts like that half press, and it just throws you back into live view. So whatever you finally found in the menus, you have now lost. Now, finally on the Z6 II, they have set up some options in terms of what you can do with the press of the joystick. It doesn't have to knock you back into the menus, but the best I can do is turn it off. There's no option for making a selection in a menu, and this is something that I think is just an oversight. It's probably something that from an engineering standpoint and a developer standpoint is probably more complicated to solve than I'm making it sound like, but it's something that I really think needs to be in here for the user experience. One other small nitpicky thing is the ability to turn on or off the auto ISO sensitivity. Now, Nikon have had a great system for a number of years for handling auto ISO. So basically what you're going to do is you're going to set it up saying, okay, well, I can go between the base ISO and then what's the maximum ISO I want it to give me. And then what it will do is automatically select depending on your shutter speed and your exposure. So you can be in manual mode and still have auto ISO. This is, for the most part, wonderful, but sometimes you're shooting something in a studio situation or a controlled environment and you want to be able to turn that off and just say, hey, I want this at 100 ISO or 200 ISO. Well, there's several options for getting to ISO. There's a dedicated button on the top of the camera. You can go in from several different directions, but the only way to get to the menu where you can actually turn that off is by using the info button, selecting ISO, and then you have to use the down arrow to go down to turn that on or off. Again, this is super nitpicky, and it's something that I'm not switching back and forth constantly between, but it's just a bunch of steps, and you have to remember where that is, and sometimes you don't necessarily want to be using auto sensitivity. So I do want to make it clear that these are minor complaints, but from my standpoint anyway, it's something that's just put a couple kinks in the whole user experience. When you consider that the Z6, the original, was Nikon's first adventure into full-frame mirrorless, I think they did a really nice job, and some of these things are to be expected, especially from a company that's used to making something in a DSLR format. This is version 2, and I was kind of hoping some of those things would be cleaned up at this point, but it is what it is. I think it's still a fantastic camera. I also want to mention that there are two new power options. So the first of all is we have a new battery. It actually was debuted with the Z Z5. I think this is actually a really smart way to do this. This battery has a higher capacity, but the camera is still back compatible with older batteries as well. So if you have a bunch of batteries lying around from your Z6, they will work in this camera, but now you have the option of buying higher capacities as well. And you can power the camera via USB-C, which is pretty standard on most cameras. If you're doing a lot of video work or if you're doing a long studio shoot, this might be a better option for you. I think definitely for video, but now we have it. We're going to talk about video, and I also want to give some overall thoughts on this camera and whether I think it's worth coming into this system. But real quick, I want to give a shout out to our sponsor today, who are the awesome folks over at Squarespace.com. Squarespace is the easiest way to build a photography website and earn money while doing it. So start with one of their award-winning templates and build your site. You can drag and drop images to build beautiful galleries, so there's no code to write and no server to manage. Squarespace also have tools to make your website work for you. They now have member-only areas for managing an audience and communicating directly, complete with audience insights. Make money with their advanced e-commerce tools for merchandising, inventory management, secure payments, and you can also extend e-commerce with Squarespace extensions. These are third-party tools that let you manage inventory, bookkeeping, filing sales tax, and even shipping items across the globe. You can take your photography and turn it into a business that works for you. So head over to squarespace.com and sign up for the free trial. When you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/AOP and save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Once again, that is squarespace.com/AOP. And I want to give a special shout out and thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Let's talk about video on the Z6 II. Now, when the original Z6 came out, especially at that time, I felt that Nikon had offered us a surprisingly really good package, especially at the price point when you want to get into full-frame video work. In fact, considering it was Nikon, who really haven't done much with video over the years, and I felt like they'd been lagging behind, really stepped up with the Z6. All of those features and functionality are brought over to the Z6 II. There were some major additions that I'm really excited about. Unfortunately, they're not available yet. They're going to come in a firmware update. One of them is the ability to record 60p. So if you want to overcrank and be able to do slow-mo in post, that option will be available. I would guess that it's probably going to be at a slight crop, but at least it will still be in here. Speaking of crop, we do have the ability now to shoot in an APS-C format. I don't see really what the gain is here, other than maybe if you're shooting with a prime lens and you want to be able to zoom in all of a sudden, but that is available to us as well. And we now have the ability to select the direction you want manual focus to move in. This is particularly handy if you're used to a certain lens set, and Nikon is backwards from that. You can actually flip that around and customize it so you can have the focus direction to your taste at this point. I think that's a major addition. We've also got some file format changes that I want to talk about. Now, these were available in the Z6 for an upgrade price, and it's kind of the same deal with the Z6 II. So if you want the ability to record ProRes RAW or now Blackmagic RAW, you can actually send your camera into an authorized Nikon service department and you can pay the extra fee and you can have that enabled. I'm not really sure why that's, well, I understand why it's probably an extra fee and it has to do with licensing on being able to record in those formats. I'm just not sure of why you have to send it into a service center. Nikon have not been clear about that. And personally, I feel like because that's one extra step, I guess that's cool if you're not going to shoot video, you're going to not have to pay for it essentially. But I would really like to have the option just to be able to buy a camera and not have to fool around with sending it in, but it's nice that it's there. But depending on how or what you shoot, you might not even need it, because I think that N-Log, which comes stock in all of these cameras, like it did on the original Nikon Z6, is excellent. It is one of the best log profiles. I feel it's super easy to grade. You don't have to go hunt down LUTs and do a lot of color correcting. It's just really straightforward. It's also 10-bit. Now, it is external only. You can't record N-Log internal, mainly because it's a 10-bit format. But to be honest, if you're really serious about video, this camera does not have the flipping or articulating screen, so there is a little bit of a catch there. I would highly recommend that for anything serious video related, you do get an external monitor so you can put that front facing. That's kind of how I film all of my YouTube videos, even if I'm using a camera with the flippy screen, because you end up with a bigger monitor and it's just really nice to have. Plus you can record N-Log. One new feature that's really small, but I think it's actually kind of a big deal. So on the back of the camera where your eyepiece is, where you're going to look through for the viewfinder, there's a little sensor on the eyepiece that tells it whether your eye is up to the camera or not. And in the past, if you've been shooting video and you have the screen pulled out and articulated somewhat, if your hand moves in front of this, it blacks out the LCD and flips over to the viewfinder. Well, Well, now they have this set, so when you actually pull this out, this is deactivated. So I know that's a really small thing, but you'd be surprised of how many times that actually became a slight annoyance if you're trying to shoot video. It's now fixed. So I guess the big question on many people's minds is the dual processors worth an upgrade to the Z6 II? Honestly, I think it is. For what I use this camera for and the fact that I loved the original Z6, I have noticed a considerable performance boost in this camera. The image quality did get a little boost too. We have a little more dynamic range, but I think the autofocus is just more refined, more matured in this. I think you have more options in terms of tracking an autofocus. I did mention some interface complaints, but that's something that Nikon can fix eventually on their end, and that's why I wanted to make it known in this review. But I do think it's an excellent camera, and especially my main reason for wanting to have this is because I think Nikon are doing some great stuff with the Z lenses. There's a lot of 1.8s and a lot of 1.8s and a lot of f4s, but they're finally starting to come out with the faster glass, and I even think the f1.8s and the f4s are really good lenses. I think Nikon are on the top of their lens game right now. We've got the 51.2 coming out. We've got some 2.8 zooms finally. I think that there is some really good glass that are worth pairing up with this body. That being said, you can also use this with legacy glass. So for instance, AFS lenses, it works really well with. I know there's a hole there with the AFD lenses or any kind of screw drive lens, but also manual focus lenses, it just seems to play ball well with, and I can take advantage of the NEF files and that beautiful image in the end. Anyway, I would love to know what you guys think, so drop me a comment below. We'll talk about this camera in some more videos in the coming months, but I'll catch you guys in the next video. Until then, later.